So we can talk about how the elements move from one place to another. We can talk about these cycles of elements moving, and we can refer to them as the biogeochemical cycles. So bio in this case means life, geo means earth, and then the chemical refers to like the chemical transformations that these elements make. So we're going to talk about, for example, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the sulfur cycle. So all of those are important elements that we have inside of our bodies and are found in other living organisms as well. So when we talk about the cycles, we can talk about storages. So where are elements stored? And there are actually 5 basic places where elements can be stored. They can be stored in the atmosphere. Like, for example, as a gas, we could talk about the storage in the ocean, in the water. We could talk about the storage in rocks on the earth. So we could talk about the earth's crust. We could also talk about soil. So we're going to spend some time talking about soil, but that is the level of the that top layer of the earth that has lots of living things in it. So that's the soil. We can also say that we have in the biota. So that would be in the living things. So that would be like plants, that would be like corals, that would be like jellyfish, that would be like us. So these are the 5 storages. Now things can move from one place to another, and that is referred to as flows. So say, for example, when it goes from the atmosphere into the ocean, that would be a flow. When we talk about it from going from the atmosphere into living things, that would be a flow. So these are flows. Now, we did talk about entropy and how we have spontaneous processes and non-spontaneous processes. So some of these flows are spontaneous, meaning that they do not take any extra energy. And say, for example, when we talk about carbon dioxide will spontaneously, if it is more concentrated in the atmosphere, will spontaneously move into the ocean in order to kind of reach an equilibrium. So that would be where it is going generally from a more concentrated form to a less concentrated form. We also have non-spontaneous flows. And so this would be where we're taking it and we're concentrating the energy. So a good example of this is when we take carbon from the atmosphere and we put it into a living plant. And so that would be a non-spontaneous flow. So let's look at some examples of this in terms of the carbon cycle. When we talk about the carbon cycle, we can talk about the carbon that is in our atmosphere. It is CO2. This is not a toxin, but rather it is a gas that we now know, if it accumulates in certain parts of our atmosphere, is an example of a greenhouse gas. So we know that CO2 buildup in our atmosphere is not a good thing because it is causing a warming of our planet. So we have the CO2 in the atmosphere. This can be taken up by plants. And in fact, it's kind of interesting, with an increase in CO2, you might predict that plants will actually have more carbon for growth. And so like places in the rainforest might even become more carbon. There might be bigger trees and more vegetation because of the presence of the CO2. So this process of taking CO2 and putting it into plants is non-spontaneous. Where is the energy? What energy source do we use? That would be photosynthesis. So I could put that in like a different color. I could say this process, this flow, is photosynthesis, and it is non-spontaneous because it requires light energy to do it. So if we look at an image of this, you can see that the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere the carbon is less dense, it's less condensed. And then when we look at the carbon in plants, we have organic molecules. And one organic molecule that plants build is what is referred to as cellulose. And cellulose is like the structure, it's like the woody, it's like the fiber in a plant. Okay. So from the plants, this CO2 could then be eaten by animals. So we could change that color and we can go animals. So that CO2 flowed from the plant into the animal. Now that is also non-spontaneous because we are going to have to eat it. That's going to require energy. Digestion is going to require energy. And then we could incorporate that organic material in our body. In the case of carbon, like sugars, this is what we would use for energy. And so then animals are going to release that CO2 back into the atmosphere. So we'll go back, CO2 in atmosphere. Right? We breathe out carbon dioxide. That process of taking and burning carbohydrates and producing CO2 would be non-spontaneous, and it would be an example of cellular respiration. So here we could put cellular respiration. Now this cycling could go back to the plants. So for example, I could put my CO2 back into a plant, right? It was in me, now it's going back into a plant. And in the case of what happened many, many millions of years ago, these plants, for example, became fossil fuels. So the plants, when they produce in abundance and then they become covered over, say like, for example, in bogs by sediments, and then decomposition occurs and great forces are exerted on that plant material, then we could have death and decomposition that produces fossil fuels. So death, decomposition, and this could create fossil fuels. So we could store carbon in the fossil fuels, and that used to be actually a dead end for the carbon. So until we developed ways to drill down into the Earth's crust in order to extract it, that carbon was stored there, and it didn't spontaneously flow back into the atmosphere. So that would have been a kind of a dead end to this cycle. However, because we burn fossil fuels, when we burn the fossil fuels, this is actually a spontaneous process of burning, and this releases CO2. So CO2, when we burn, CO2 is released from a higher concentration up into the atmosphere. So say, for example, in the case of propane, that CO2 goes into the atmosphere when we burn it on our gas grill. And so that would be CO2 in the atmosphere. And so we can also look at how CO2 from the burning of fossil fuels then moves into our oceans. So this would be a spontaneous flow, again, because the CO2 is in the atmosphere. It's being produced by the burning of fossil fuels. And then it is more concentrated in the atmosphere. So what's going to happen is it's going to spontaneously be taken up by the oceans. Now, this can be a good thing because CO2 could be used by organisms in the ocean, like phytoplankton, and also like coral, which also are producers. But unfortunately, it also makes the ocean more acidic. So when CO2 goes and combines with water, it forms carbonic acid. So this is my carbonic acid. This is actually the same thing that happens when we force CO2 into water to create carbonated water or soda pop, right? And then that CO2 forms an acid, which is not necessarily good for our teeth. When we look at in the ocean, this carbonic acid causes or is causing ocean acidification. So the ocean is basic, which means that it has a high pH of like 8, but it is becoming more acidic, so it's moving towards acidity. Now, this is not necessarily a problem, but it is a problem because in acidic conditions, the exoskeletons and the shells of aquatic organisms start to break down. So, for example, the shells of shrimp and other crustaceans like krill and zooplankton, the shells of oysters and clams start to break down. So this ocean acidification is a separate issue from global warming, but it is a huge problem because of the spontaneous flow of carbon dioxide into our oceans. Now, when that CO2 gets into the ocean, it can be taken up by organisms. So let's look at this part right here. So we can talk about CO2 bringing in, and then it can actually be used to build structures like coral reefs, and shells. So the structures, when we take CO2 in the ocean, CO2 can become calcium carbonate, which is CaCO3, I believe, calcium carbonate. So this is, I'll just write this as calcium carbonate. So this is what makes up shells. This is what makes up reefs, right? This is actually what makes up limestone and marble. So sometimes when you're out hiking in a desert, maybe even, and you come upon a limestone formation, that actually used to be an ancient seabed that the organisms died that had those shells died, and then it became sediments. And so we have that calcium carbonate. Interestingly, if you have, you know that if you have marble or limestone tiles or other things in your house, it's really important not to use vinegar to wash them, because vinegar dissolves calcium carbonate, just like the acid in the ocean also dissolves calcium carbonate. And so this is an interesting part of the carbon cycle. Let's look at it here. So from the atmosphere, it goes into the ocean, and then the ocean can, organisms, the producers, can take that carbon out of the ocean, and then they can create sediments, right? So that is like in the sedimentary rock, like in limestone and other sedimentary rocks. They can also, it's important to realize that plants also use sugars to produce energy, so they also release CO2. So they take it in during photosynthesis, and then they also release the CO2. If we look at this diagram that shows more information than you need to know, we can see the flows. So again, the death and decomposition of organisms a long time ago formed what are referred to as fossil fuels. And then we use those fossil fuels like to produce cement, it's a big use, and other energy. And then we release those into the atmosphere. So the burning of fossil fuels is a huge part of the human impact on the carbon cycle. Another impact of human activity on the carbon cycle is deforestation. So whenever you burn and cut down specifically like slash and burn, like in the Amazon, where they're cutting down vast swaths of rainforest and then burning them to get the nutrients into the soil, but the carbon goes up into the atmosphere. So deforestation is going to release CO2 into the atmosphere. We also obviously have natural processes of fire, right? Natural processes of decay. So when things die and they decay, the microorganisms also release carbon into the atmosphere. And then just the movement of CO2 from the ocean, if the concentration becomes greater in the ocean, it is just going to move back into the atmosphere. So these are just some examples of the flows of carbon through the carbon cycle.